A member of Parliament, a decorated war hero, and the godson of a British Prime Minister, faced life imprisonment with hard labor when his secret same-sex romance was exposed. Yet, the day before his scheduled appearance at the preliminary hearings for the most explosive scandal of the 19th century, Lord Arthur Clinton suddenly died. Was it a suicide to protect his family's honor? A ruthless assassination to silence him and shield the British crown? Or a perfectly orchestrated fake death, allowing him to escape across the ocean? The Victorian era operated on a foundation of unyielding moral absolutes and strict social hierarchy. The British Empire, then at the absolute zenith of its global power, demanded that its domestic society reflect an image of perfect discipline, propriety, and order. Beneath the gaslit streets and the polished facades of aristocratic estates, a relentless policing of morality took place. The criminalization of homosexuality was absolute, codified in laws designed to completely obliterate the social and physical existence of anyone found guilty. Discovery guaranteed the total forfeiture of wealth, status, and freedom. Yet, the severity of these consequences did not eradicate the clandestine lives of those who refused to conform. It merely pushed them into a high-stakes existence where one misstep meant total destruction. Lord Arthur Clinton existed precisely on this razor-thin edge, navigating the treacherous space between his obligations as a pillar of the British establishment and his undeniable private truth. The collapse of this delicate existence began on the evening of April 28, 1870, at the Strand Theatre in London. The theatre district was a bustling epicenter of Victorian entertainment, filled with a cross-section of society ranging from wealthy patrons in private boxes to the working class in the gallery. Among the crowd that night were two figures who commanded the attention of the room. They were, by all outward appearances, two striking, highly fashionable aristocratic women. They wore magnificent, sweeping evening gowns crafted from heavy silk and expensive satin, tailored perfectly to current high society trends. Their faces were expertly powdered, and they wore intricate jewelry that reflected the ambient theater lighting. They carried themselves with the practiced grace of upper-class women enjoying a standard evening of leisure. As the performance concluded and the crowds began to spill out onto the cobblestones of the Strand, the carefully maintained illusion was violently shattered. Plainclothes police officers, acting on intelligence gathered over a year-long surveillance operation, moved swiftly through the departing audience. They intercepted the two women just as they exited the venue. The authorities executed an immediate arrest, forcibly detaining them in front of stunned onlookers. The two figures were not aristocratic women, but Ernest Boulton, known widely in underground theatrical circles as Stella, and Frederick Park, known as Fanny. The arrest of Bolton and Park was not treated as a minor disturbance. It was instantly weaponized by the authorities as a major moral crusade. It became the defining cross-dressing and homosexuality scandal of the Victorian age. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Hundreds of morbidly curious citizens, alerted by the rapid spread of street gossip and early newspaper bulletins, descended upon Bow Street Magistrates' Court. They crowded the streets and the gallery just to witness the spectacle of the two young men being paraded in their ruined, dirtied silk dresses. The visual shock of men in women's aristocratic clothing being hauled before a magistrate struck at the very core of Victorian gender anxieties and societal norms. While the public fixated on the theatrical spectacle at Bow Street, a far more destructive operation was underway across the city. Police investigators descended upon the private residence Bolton and Park, shared at 13 Wakefield Street. The raid was thorough and uncompromising. Officers tore through the apartment, cataloging every item that could be used to secure a conviction for gross indecency and conspiracy. In the center of the rooms, they discovered a large theatrical trunk. Inside, they found an extensive wardrobe of women's clothing, intricate wigs, imported cosmetics, and corsets. However, beneath the layers of silk and satin, the investigators unearthed a cache of evidence that immediately elevated the case from a shocking street-level scandal to a crisis of national proportions. They found a massive collection of personal correspondence, thousands of highly intimate, unguarded love letters. The detectives carefully examined the documents, noting the premium quality of the stationery. Stamped at the top of a significant portion of these letters was a distinct, recognizable aristocratic family crest. The handwriting was matched, and the signatures were clear. They belonged to Lord Arthur Clinton, a sitting member of Parliament and a scion of one of the most powerful political dynasties in the British Empire. The contents of the letters left no room for ambiguity. They detailed a domestic, deeply affectionate relationship between the nobleman and Ernest Bolton. In the ink of his own hand, Lord Arthur repeatedly referred to Bolton as his beloved wife. The discovery of these letters was a catastrophic breach of the protective wall that usually shielded the aristocracy from the consequences of the law. Overnight, Lord Arthur Clinton was dragged from the protected halls of Westminster into the center of a severe criminal conspiracy. The charge of being an accomplice in this network of illicit behavior carried a mandatory life sentence of hard labor, a punishment that would undoubtedly break a man accustomed to the comforts of high society. The legal machinery moved with terrifying speed. On June 17, 1870, the authorities officially served Lord Arthur Clinton with a subpoena, legally compelling him to stand trial and face cross-examination in open court. The prospect of an MP, a close associate of the royal family, taking the stand to answer questions about his sexual relationship with a male crossdresser threatened to inflict incalculable damage on the government. The establishment was on the brink of a catastrophic public humiliation. But how did a decorated son of a duke end up in the crosshairs of London's vice police? The foundation of Lord Arthur Clinton's life was constructed on absolute privilege, yet deeply compromised by private scandal long before he ever met Ernest Bolton. Born on June 23, 1840, in Christchurch, Hampshire, he entered a world defined by immense wealth, vast estates, and political supremacy. He was the third son of Henry Pelham Clinton, the fifth Duke of Newcastle. The Newcastle name was not merely a title. It was a pillar of the British state. His father served as a prominent cabinet minister, holding the crucial position of Secretary of State for War during the Crimean conflict. To be born a Clinton was to be born into the governing machinery of the empire. This destiny was cemented at Arthur's baptism, where the towering figure of British politics, William Ewart Gladstone, the man who would become the defining prime minister of the Victorian age, stood as his godfather. The Clinton family's proximity to absolute power extended directly into the heart of the monarchy. They did not just serve the crown, they were intimately woven into the private lives of the royal family. Arthur's sister, Lady Susan Vane Tempest, held a position of profound, albeit precarious, influence as one of the closest confidantes and recognized mistresses of the Prince of Wales, the future King Edward VII. This relationship placed the Clintons in an elite, untouchable tier of society, shielding them with the protective shadow of the future monarch. Yet, living in the immediate orbit of the throne required a flawless public facade. Any misstep by a member of the Clinton family threatened not only their own standing, but risked exposing the monarchy to public scrutiny. Behind the imposing doors of the family estates, the reality of Arthur's upbringing was fractured and deeply unstable. The Victorian ideal of the pious, unified aristocratic family was entirely absent in his childhood. In 1850, when Arthur was just 10 years old, the Duke and Duchess of Newcastle underwent a spectacular and highly destructive public divorce. His mother, Lady Susan Hamilton, abandoned the family to elope with a lover, Lord Horatio Walpole. During this era, divorce was exceptionally rare, requiring a literal act of Parliament to dissolve the marriage. The proceedings laid bare the family's most intimate secrets before the House of Lords and the national press. The Duchess was socially annihilated, completely exiled from polite society. The fallout from the divorce left a permanent psychological scar on the family, but for Arthur, the damage was acutely personal. Persistent, damaging whispers circulated through the upper echelons of London society that he was not the biological son of the Duke, but rather the product of one of his mother's illicit affairs. While the Duke officially recognized him, this lingering rumor of illegitimacy marked Arthur as an outsider within his own bloodline. He carried the heavy burden of the Newcastle name without the security of truly belonging to it, creating a deep internal conflict that would eventually drive his rebellion against the society that judged him. Determined to forge an independent identity away from the toxic environment of his family's estates, Arthur followed the traditional path of the aristocracy, beginning his education at the elite confines of Eton College. However, the rigid academic structure held little appeal. At the age of 14, he escaped into the disciplined, hierarchical world of the Royal Navy. The military offered a brutal but meritocratic environment where actions mattered more than lineage. Arthur did not merely wear the uniform for ceremonial purposes. He was thrust into the violent reality of imperial expansion. During the Indian Mutiny of 1857, the teenage Arthur found himself in the center of one of the most brutal conflicts of the century. He participated in the harrowing relief of Lucknow, witnessing firsthand the carnage, the extreme privation, and the desperate close-quarters combat that defined the siege. This experience hardened him. The man who would later be mocked in the press as a degenerate aristocrat was, in reality, a combat veteran who had survived the horrors of war. He proved his courage under fire, earning medals and the respect of his superiors. Yet, even his military career could not escape the gravitational pull of public scandal. In 1864, a bizarre and highly damaging incident occurred. The British press published sensational reports detailing a court-martial for a serious charge of naval desertion, naming Lord Arthur Clinton as the culprit. The public condemnation was swift and brutal. It took frantic efforts by the family to force the newspapers to print a retraction, revealing that the deserter was actually his younger brother, Lord Albert Clinton. The press had simply confused the two siblings. Though Arthur's military record was cleared and he was subsequently promoted to the rank of first lieutenant, the incident served as a stark reminder of how quickly society would turn on a nobleman and how eagerly the public consumed the disgrace of the elite. By 1865, Arthur transitioned from the harsh realities of the Navy to the treacherous political battlegrounds of London. Leveraging his family's influence, he successfully campaigned to become the Member of Parliament for Newark, a borough that had long been controlled by the Newcastle political machine. Entering the House of Commons, he was expected to take his place among the ruling class, following in the footsteps of his father and his godfather, Gladstone. However, the reality of serving as a Victorian Member of Parliament was financially crippling. MPs were entirely unpaid, expected to fund their political careers, their London residences, and their extensive social obligations out of their own private wealth. As a third son with a clouded lineage, Arthur's allowance was wholly insufficient to maintain the lavish lifestyle required of a Clinton in the capital. He fell into a dangerous cycle of borrowing, utilizing his aristocratic title to secure massive lines of credit from London's most aggressive moneylenders, tailors, jewelers, and hoteliers. The facade finally collapsed in November 1868. Arthur's creditors, realizing the money was gone and the family was unwilling to bail him out, moved to destroy him. He was officially declared bankrupt. The sheer scale of his financial ruin was staggering. He had amassed debts totaling £70,000, a sum equivalent to roughly £6. 8 million in today's currency. A public bankruptcy for an aristocrat was a profound social death. His assets were seized, his debts were published in the national gazettes, and he was completely stripped of his parliamentary seat. Overnight, the combat veteran and promising politician was reduced to a public liability. He was barred from the exclusive gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall, shunned by former political allies, and viewed with deep embarrassment by his family. Stripped of his wealth, his political career, and his social standing, Lord Arthur was cast out of the rigid world he had been raised to rule. It was in this state of total isolation, profound debt, and social exile that he encountered the vibrant, defiant underworld of London, and crossed paths with the one person who offered him an escape from the crushing weight of his ruined name. The rigid structures of Victorian London were designed to segregate and control. The wealthy retreated to the manicured squares of Mayfair and Belgravia, while the impoverished were pushed into the disease-ridden slums of the East End. Yet, intersecting these two extremes was a thriving, invisible subculture, a nocturnal world where the strict boundaries of class and sexuality dissolved. Areas like the Haymarket and the Burlington Arcade transformed after dark, becoming the epicenters of a clandestine society where men who desired other men could find connection. For Lord Arthur Clinton, a man whose public identity had been completely dismantled by bankruptcy and social exile, this underground world did not represent a descent into depravity. Instead, it offered a profound sense of liberation. Stripped of his parliamentary seat, his fortune, and the suffocating expectations of the Newcastle dynasty, Arthur found himself unburdened. He was no longer a failing aristocrat. He was a man who could finally pursue his private truth. It was within this shadowed network of theaters, private rooms, and covert meeting places that Arthur encountered Ernest Bolton. Bolton was not merely a young man who occasionally wore women's clothing. He was an absolute master of gender illusion. The son of a middle-class stockbroker, Bolton possessed a delicate bone structure, striking violet blue eyes, and a natural cascade of dark curls. When he assumed the persona of Stella, the transformation was flawless. He did not look like a man in a dress. He looked entirely like a highly bred, exquisitely fashionable aristocratic woman. Bolton had spent years studying the mannerisms, the vocal cadences, and the subtle social cues of upper-class ladies. He could walk into a crowded theater, a high-end restaurant, or a bustling railway station in full feminine attire and pass completely undetected. The connection between Arthur and Bolton was immediate and deeply intense. For Arthur, who had spent his life surrounded by the cold, calculating alliances of the political and aristocratic elite, Bolton offered a raw, authentic, and dangerous devotion. They did not view their relationship as a temporary, illicit affair. They fundamentally considered themselves a married couple, a concept so radical for the 1860s that it defied the basic comprehension of the legal system. They constructed a domestic life that aggressively mocked the institutions that sought to destroy them. Bolton proudly wore a gold wedding band on his left hand. In a breathtaking display of audacity, he commissioned a London printer to create high-quality, engraved personal calling cards bearing the name Lady Arthur Clinton. He would present these cards to shopkeepers, hotel clerks, and acquaintances without a trace of hesitation. Arthur, despite the crushing weight of his recent bankruptcy, assumed the role of the devoted provider. He secured lodgings near Bolton's residence and funneled whatever remaining funds he could scrape together or borrow from sympathetic friends into maintaining Stella's lifestyle. He paid the rent, bought the expensive silk dresses, and settled the daily bills for Bolton's personal hairdresser, who arrived every morning to arrange Stella's elaborate curls. Living this truth in Victorian London required a staggering level of psychological fortitude. The Offences Against the Person Act of 1861 had removed the death penalty for sodomy, but it replaced it with penal servitude for life, a punishment that often involved brutal hard labor designed to break a man physically and mentally. Every time Arthur and Bolton stepped out of their door together, they were gambling with their lives. Yet, instead of hiding in the shadows, they actively courted the spotlight. They were addicted to the thrill of hiding in plain sight. They frequently embarked on theatrical tours across the English countryside, accompanied by Frederick Park, who performed under the name Fanny. The provincial audiences, hungry for entertainment, flocked to see the glamorous women perform. Bolton and Park would take the stage, sometimes acting alongside Arthur, playing out dramatic romantic scenes. The audiences cheered, entirely oblivious to the reality that the passionate embraces they were witnessing between the male and female leads were, in fact, genuine expressions of love between two men. It was a brilliant, subversive joke played on an empire that prided itself on moral absolutes. The stage provided a temporary sanctuary where their truth was disguised as art, but their defiance extended far beyond the provincial theaters. They were equally reckless in the heart of London. They frequented public spaces, testing the limits of their deception. A notorious incident occurred at the Haxall Hotel, a popular establishment on the busy thoroughfare of the Strand. During a crowded public ball, Lord Arthur and Bolton made no effort to conceal their affection. Jack Saul, a well-known male prostitute deeply embedded in the London underground, later testified under oath that he had watched the nobleman and the cross-dresser openly embracing and kissing in front of the other guests. They were daring the world to see them, challenging the authorities to enforce the draconian laws. This brazen lifestyle, however, could not remain undetected indefinitely. The sheer scale of their public appearances, the whispering campaigns in the theater districts, and the obvious extravagance of their wardrobe began to draw the attention of the Metropolitan Police. The authorities did not act immediately. Instead, they launched a slow, methodical surveillance operation. Plainclothes detectives began tailing Bolton and Park, watching them as they moved between theaters, private apartments, and public squares. The detectives noted who they spoke to, where they bought their clothing, and, most importantly, who was funding their expensive lifestyle. The net was being carefully woven, and at the center of it was Lord Arthur Clinton, a man whose aristocratic hubris and desperate need for love had blinded him to the imminent danger closing in around him. The police were patient. They knew that arresting two cross-dressers on the street would result in a minor charge of disturbing the peace. They wanted a major conspiracy, a case that would send a shockwave through the city and reassert the moral authority of the law. They waited for the perfect moment to strike, tracking the couple for over a year, silently building a devastating dossier of evidence. Every letter sent, every hotel room booked, and every public embrace was noted and filed. The authorities were not just preparing to break up a romance. They were preparing to annihilate Lord Arthur Clinton. The trap, meticulously set and patiently maintained by the Metropolitan Police, finally snapped shut on the stone steps of the Strand Theatre. When the hands of the arresting officers clamped down on the silk-clad shoulders of Ernest Bolton and Frederick Park, the illusion of their aristocratic female personas was violently torn away. They were immediately dragged from the glowing gaslight of the theater district into the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the Victorian penal system. The authorities were not merely interested in prosecuting a misdemeanor offense of public disturbance. They were constructing a grand, sweeping case of moral corruption that would implicate the highest levels of British society. At the very center of their crosshairs was Lord Arthur Clinton. The initial hours of the arrest were designed to degrade and humiliate. Bolton and Park, still wearing their elaborate evening gowns, corsets, and heavy stage makeup, were thrown into the holding cells at Bow Street. The visual contrast between their luxurious feminine attire and the filthy iron-barred confines of a Victorian jail was a spectacle the police eagerly exploited. However, the true horror of their detention began when the legal system demanded physical proof of their alleged crimes. The Victorian legal framework surrounding homosexuality was deeply tied to early, often heavily flawed, medical science. The authorities firmly believed that physical deviance left undeniable anatomical scars, and they were determined to find them. The men were subjected to forceful, non-consensual physical examinations conducted by the police surgeon, Dr. James Paul. Stripped of their clothing and their dignity, Bolton and Park were treated not as citizens awaiting trial, but as biological anomalies to be catalogued. Dr. Paul was tasked with finding definitive proof of sodomy, a charge that required exacting physical evidence to secure a conviction for the maximum penalty of life imprisonment. In his zealous attempt to provide the prosecution with the necessary ammunition, Dr. Paul formulated a medical theory that was as invasive as it was scientifically baseless. He later stood before the court and confidently testified that the bodies of the defendants exhibited specific physical deformities. He argued, with grim medical authority, that these alterations were the direct anatomical result of the pulling force and friction associated with habitual homosexual intercourse. This testimony was intended to be the prosecution's killing blow, a piece of irrefutable scientific evidence that would seal the fate of everyone involved, including the absent Lord Arthur. But the defense team, heavily funded by the wealthy families of the accused and acutely aware of the stakes, launched a devastating counterattack. They recognized that they could not win a debate on morality in a Victorian courtroom, so they chose to annihilate the police surgeon's science. The defense enlisted 6 of the most prominent, highly respected independent medical professionals in London. These were men of unassailable reputation, physicians who catered to the elite and whose medical opinions carried the weight of absolute authority. They conducted their own thorough examinations of Bolton and Park. Taking the stand, these eminent doctors systematically dismantled Dr. Paul's findings. They testified unequivocally that the bodies of the young men were completely normal and showed no signs of the bizarre deformations the police surgeon had claimed. They exposed Dr. Paul's theory as a desperate fiction, heavily implying that the police had attempted to manufacture medical evidence to secure a high-profile conviction. The complete destruction of the physical evidence severely crippled the prosecution's primary line of attack. Deprived of their anatomical proof, the prosecutors pivoted to their secondary, yet far more explosive, weapon, the documentary evidence. The raid on the Wakefield Street apartment had yielded a staggering archive of personal correspondence. The court dedicated an entire grueling day of the trial exclusively to the reading of over 1,000 confiscated letters. This was a public execution of privacy. The most intimate, unguarded thoughts of the defendants and their social circle were read aloud by stern court officials to a packed, breathless gallery of reporters, magistrates, and morbidly curious onlookers. The letters transformed the courtroom from a theater of legal debate into a window overlooking a deeply hidden subculture. The correspondence between Lord Arthur Clinton and Ernest Bolton laid bare a relationship that was overwhelmingly domestic, often mundane, and completely devoid of the monstrous depravity the prosecution sought to portray. Bolton's letters to the nobleman read exactly like those of a demanding, slightly spoiled spouse. In one letter, he scolded Arthur with familiar petulance, writing, "Haven't you sent me any money, you brute?" In another, he offered a casually humorous excuse for a lapse in their correspondence, admitting, "We were so drunk last night that I forgot to write." These were not the writings of a criminal mastermind. They were the everyday squabbles and affectionate demands of a couple deeply entrenched in their shared life. Frederick Park's letters to Arthur were equally revealing, showcasing a tight-knit chosen family. Fully committed to his persona as Stella's sister, Park referred to the aristocrat as his brother-in-law. When thanking Arthur for a birthday present, Park demonstrated the dark, sharp humor that characterized their circle, writing, "It is wonderful that you remembered my birthday. I don't want to live to be 100 because the money for makeup to hide the wrinkles will cost too much." The letters stripped away the legal severity of the charges and exposed the vibrant, deeply human reality of their existence. The net cast by the letters dragged in figures from far beyond the immediate circle in London. A former lover named Louis Hurt was exposed through his earnest practical advice to Bolton. Knowing the risks of their lifestyle, Hurt had written to urge Bolton to grow a mustache, hoping it would make him appear more masculine in public and help him avoid the very police attention that had now ruined them. More shockingly, the correspondence implicated international diplomats. John Safford Fiske, the sitting American consul in Edinburgh, had been a frequent correspondent. His letters were poetic, elevated, and deeply romantic, comparing Bolton's beauty to the legendary figures of Greek mythology. Fiske's letters also revealed the crushing pressure to conform. He agonized to Bolton over whether he should marry a foolish, wealthy heiress with a fortune of £30,000, simply to purchase a shield of societal respectability and hide his true nature from the world. As the thousands of words washed over the courtroom, a stark legal reality began to emerge. The letters proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that these men loved each other, lived together, and completely defied the gender norms of the 19th century. But they did not contain explicit confessions of the specific physical acts required by Victorian law to prove the felony of sodomy. The prosecution had successfully demonstrated that the men were highly unconventional, but without the discredited medical evidence, they could not definitively prove the specific criminal act that warranted life imprisonment. The legal ordeal dragged on for another year. Finally, in May 1871, at the Court of Queen's Bench, the judge delivered his instructions to the jury, emphasizing the strict requirements of the law over the moral outrage of the press. Because the prosecution failed to provide direct physical evidence of sexual intercourse, the jury acquitted all the defendants of the primary charges. Bolton, Park, and the others walked out of the courtroom as free men, greeted by the deafening, chaotic cheers of the public gallery. It was a monumental, humiliating defeat for the Metropolitan Police and the moral crusaders of the establishment. The men they had sought to destroy had slipped through the rigid fingers of the law. Yet the victory was hollow. The most prized target of the prosecution, the man whose aristocratic title would have made the trial the defining moral victory of the decade, was missing. Lord Arthur Clinton never stood in the dock. He never heard his private letters read aloud by a hostile prosecutor, and he never heard the verdict that would have saved him from the gallows of public opinion. He had already vanished. The abrupt disappearance of Lord Arthur Clinton from the annals of the Bolton and Park trial was not a matter of chance. It was a highly synchronized event that occurred at the precise moment maximum damage was about to be inflicted upon the British ruling class. On June 17, 1870, a court officer delivered a formal subpoena to Lord Arthur, legally binding him to appear in the dock, alongside the cross-dressers and prostitutes of the London Underground. The document was a death warrant for his social existence, but more dangerously, it was a profound threat to the institutions he represented. A sitting member of Parliament, a decorated military officer, and a nobleman intimately connected to the future King of England was about to be cross-examined on his sexual practices with another man. The potential for constitutional embarrassment was catastrophic. Exactly one day later, on June 18, 1870, just before his scheduled appearance at the preliminary hearings for the most explosive scandal of the 19th century, the 29-year-old aristocrat was suddenly declared dead before he could utter a single word under oath. The suddenness of the event defied logic. The government and the Newcastle family released a brief, sterile statement attributing the cause of death to scarlet fever. For the public and for modern historians examining the case, the explanation was glaringly inadequate, serving only to ignite one of the most enduring mysteries of the Victorian era. The sheer improbability of the official narrative becomes evident when examining the medical reality of the claim. Scarlet fever is a bacterial illness, one that typically presents with a very clear, agonizing progression of symptoms, high fever, a distinct rash, and a severely sore throat. It was indeed a deadly disease in the 19th century, but it did not kill a previously active, healthy 29-year-old man within 24 hours of a legal summons without any prior record of severe illness. The timeline was simply too perfect. The disease struck with tactical precision, neutralizing the greatest threat to the establishment precisely when he became a liability. The rapid burial further fueled the fire of public suspicion. There was no prolonged mourning period, no grand public funeral fitting for a son of a duke, and no opportunity for the press or independent medical examiners to view the body. Lord Arthur was sealed in a coffin and removed from the public eye with desperate haste. The establishment acted not like a grieving family, but like a crisis management team disposing of hazardous material. The motive for a massive, coordinated cover-up was undeniable. The Newcastle family possessed the immense wealth and political leverage required to orchestrate an illusion of this magnitude. Furthermore, the political apparatus of the British Empire had a vested interest in Arthur's silence. His godfather, Prime Minister William Gladstone, was currently leading a government that championed moral reform and Christian virtue. A scandal involving his own godson, exposing the rampant homosexuality within the upper echelons of the aristocracy, would have provided devastating ammunition for his political rivals. The royal family, too, required insulation. Lady Susan Vane Tempest's affair with the Prince of Wales already placed the Clintons uncomfortably close to the throne. If Lord Arthur took the stand and details of his life spilled into the national newspapers, the taint of the scandal would inevitably wash over the monarchy. The establishment could not afford a trial. Therefore, Lord Arthur Clinton had to cease to exist. Two primary theories immediately took root in the back channels of London society, and both pointed toward a deliberate circumvention of justice. The first theory posited that Lord Arthur had been quietly presented with an ultimatum by his family or government operatives: face the public humiliation, the hard labor, and the destruction of the family name, or take his own life. Suicide among the disgraced aristocracy was a known, albeit unspoken, tradition, the proverbial honorable way out. A vial of poison, self-administered in the quiet of his rooms, would leave a corpse that could be quickly certified by a compliant, well-paid family physician as a victim of a sudden, virulent fever. This scenario allowed the establishment to silence the threat permanently while maintaining a thin veneer of natural tragedy. However, a second, far more audacious theory rapidly gained traction among the British public, one that resonated deeply with the era's distrust of aristocratic privilege. The public widely believed that Lord Arthur Clinton had not died at all. The theory suggested that the Newcastle family, utilizing their vast network and unlimited funds, had fabricated the death entirely. According to this narrative, a different body, perhaps procured from the slums or a medical facility, was placed in the sealed coffin, or the coffin itself was simply filled with weights. While the authorities solemnly recorded his death and a burial took place, the real Lord Arthur was being covertly smuggled out of the country. A heavily disguised nobleman, boarding a transatlantic steamer under an assumed name, vanishing into the vast expanse of the United States or the continent. The sheer mechanics of faking a death in 1870 were surprisingly feasible for a family of such influence. Medical certificates of death were easily forged or purchased from unscrupulous doctors. Port authorities could be bribed, and passports could be arranged under aliases. The system was porous for those who possessed the capital to exploit it. The idea that a powerful family would simply buy their son's way out of a life sentence resonated as a bitter truth for a working-class public who knew they would hang for far lesser crimes. The acquittal of Bolton, Park, and the other conspirators days later only deepened the mystery surrounding Arthur's fate. If the prosecution could not secure a conviction without the physical evidence against the primary participants, it is highly likely that Arthur, protected by the best barrister's money could buy, might have also escaped a guilty verdict. Yet, the risk had been too great. The mere exposure of his letters was enough to destroy his political and social standing forever. Whether dead by his own hand to spare his family, or living in enforced exile across the ocean, Lord Arthur Clinton was systematically erased from the British landscape. The man who had brazenly flaunted his love in the theaters and hotels of London was reduced to a convenient entry in a mortality ledger. The British public, acutely aware of the hypocrisies of their rulers, refused to let the narrative rest. The death of Lord Arthur Clinton did not close the book on the scandal. It merely transformed him from a disgraced politician into an enduring urban legend. The belief that he had survived, that he had beaten the system and escaped the crushing weight of Victorian morality, became an entrenched fact in the public consciousness. This absolute certainty that the aristocrat had cheated death would lay the groundwork for one of the most bizarre and successful long-con criminal enterprises of the following decade, proving that the ghost of Lord Arthur Clinton was far more profitable and far more disruptive than the man himself had ever been. The acquittal of Ernest Bolton and Frederick Park delivered a humiliating blow to the Metropolitan Police, but the legal victory did not translate into a return to their former lives. Stepping out of the courthouse as free men, they immediately confronted the reality of their new existence in London. The trial had stripped them of their anonymity. Their faces, previously known only to a select underground circle and provincial theater audiences, had been sketched, printed, and distributed across national newspapers. They were no longer just eccentric performers. They were the most notorious men in the British Empire. The police, deeply embittered by their defeat in the courtroom, maintained a hostile and constant surveillance. Plainclothes detectives continued to shadow their movements, ensuring that any attempt to revive the brazen, public cross-dressing of the Stella and Fanny personas would be met with immediate, aggressive legal retaliation. London, the city that had once offered them a thrilling clandestine playground, had transformed into an open-air prison. Frederick Park eventually succumbed to the immense pressure and the lasting physical toll of the ordeal. He traveled to the United States, seeking anonymity, but his health rapidly deteriorated. He died relatively young, far from the London theaters he once commanded, his life permanently derailed by the intense scrutiny of the British legal system. Ernest Bolton, however, proved highly resilient. He recognized that remaining in England meant living under a perpetual state of siege. To survive and to continue his career on the stage, he had to cross the Atlantic. In 1874, 4 years after the Bow Street arrests and the highly suspicious death of Lord Arthur Clinton, Bolton boarded a transatlantic steamer bound for New York. Bolton arrived in a Gilded Age New York that was vastly different from the rigid, highly policed environment of Victorian London. The American theater scene was chaotic, rapidly expanding, and far more forgiving of past scandals, provided the performer could draw a paying crowd. Bolton shed the name that had brought him infamy. He adopted the stage name Ernest Bine and successfully integrated himself into the New York theatrical circuit. He secured roles in mainstream productions, utilizing his genuine acting talent rather than relying solely on the gender illusion that had defined his time in England. He lived quietly, maintaining a low profile, heavily distancing himself from the explosive controversy of his past. It is this specific geographical relocation, Bolton's permanent move to New York, that forms the crucial linchpin in the most compelling historical theory surrounding Lord Arthur Clinton. If the Newcastle family and the British establishment successfully orchestrated Arthur's fake death in June 1870, the logistical reality of his exile demanded a destination that offered both vast geography and a willingness to ignore the pasts of wealthy foreigners. New York was the primary sanctuary for Europe's disgraced elite. The concept of the remittance man was a deeply entrenched, albeit unspoken, tradition among the British aristocracy. When a son of a noble house became an absolute liability through crippling gambling debts, severe criminal charges, or intolerable social scandals, the family did not hand him over to the police. Instead, they placed him on a ship bound for the United States, Canada, or Australia. The exiled son would receive a regular, often substantial, monthly allowance, a remittance sent through discreet banking channels. This financial support came with a single, non-negotiable condition. The exile must completely abandon his title, adopt a new identity, and never set foot on British soil again. A breach of these terms meant the immediate severance of all funds, leaving the disgraced aristocrat to fend for himself in a foreign land. Applying this established aristocratic practice to the Lord Arthur Clinton crisis provides a highly logical framework for his survival. The Newcastle family possessed the immense capital required to establish a secure, comfortable life for Arthur in America. A forged death certificate, a heavily bribed physician, and a closed coffin allowed them to satisfy the British legal system and protect the political standing of the Prime Minister and the royal family. Meanwhile, Arthur, stripped of his naval uniform and his parliamentary seat, would have been smuggled to a port, likely traveling under a common alias, funded by the deep, untraceable coffers of the Newcastle estate. If Arthur Clinton lived out his days as a wealthy, anonymous exile in New York, Bolton's arrival in the same city 4 years later shifts from a minor historical footnote to a profound personal reunion. The theory suggests that Bolton did not merely flee to America for professional reasons. He crossed the Atlantic to reunite with the man who had risked everything to fund his life and love him publicly in London. In the vast, anonymous expanse of New York, free from the draconian laws of the British Empire and the suffocating expectations of the Newcastle dynasty, the nobleman and the performer could finally exist without the constant, looming threat of the gallows or the hard labor camps. However, accepting this theory requires confronting the severe psychological toll such an exile would exact on a man like Lord Arthur Clinton. He was not a peripheral figure in British society. He was a man raised at the absolute center of imperial power. He had commanded men in combat, walked the halls of the House of Commons, and socialized with future monarchs. Faking his death required the total, permanent amputation of his identity. He could never write to his former naval comrades, he could never reclaim his military honors, and he could never publicly acknowledge his lineage. The man who had brazenly defied society at the Strand Theatre would be forced into a lifetime of rigorous, paranoid silence. The freedom purchased by his faked death came at the cost of his entire historical existence. Historians and researchers attempting to pierce the veil of the Clinton family archives have consistently encountered impenetrable silence regarding the events of June 1870. The official family records maintain the sterile narrative of a sudden, fatal bout of scarlet fever. There are no detailed physician reports outlining the progression of the disease, no records of a standard aristocratic mourning period, and no independent verifications of the body. The Newcastle family vault, the final resting place for generations of the dynasty, remains closed to modern forensic inquiry. Without an exhumation and a conclusive DNA test against surviving Clinton descendants, the physical evidence of Lord Arthur's death remains entirely based on a 19th century piece of paper signed by men who had every motivation to lie. This historical ambiguity is not merely a gap in the record. It is the defining legacy of the scandal. The establishment demanded the annihilation of Lord Arthur Clinton to preserve its own moral authority. But in executing that erasure so hastily and suspiciously, they created a permanent crack in their own facade. The working-class public of Victorian England, who keenly understood the two-tiered justice system, saw right through the official obituary. The success of Mary Jane Firno's massive fraud a decade later proved that the public fundamentally believed the ruling class was corrupt enough to fake a death and powerful enough to pull it off. They knew the laws that hanged the poor were easily bypassed by the rich. Lord Arthur Clinton, whether he died thrashing in a fevered sweat in a London room, or whether he stood on the deck of a steamer watching the English coastline vanish forever, exposed the brutal hypocrisy of his era. He forced the British Empire to look at the severe destructive lengths it would go to maintain an illusion of moral purity. His life became a violent collision between the unstoppable force of individual desire and the immovable object of institutional power. The fallout from the Strand Theatre arrests and the subsequent trial did not end with the acquittal of Ernest Boulton and Frederick Park, nor did it dissipate with the convenient vanishing of Lord Arthur Clinton. The British establishment had survived the immediate crisis, successfully severing the toxic link between the underground homosexual subculture and the highest echelons of political and royal power by erasing the nobleman from the record. However, the sheer public spectacle of the case and the humiliating defeat suffered by the Metropolitan Police in the courtroom triggered a profound and reactionary panic within the ruling class. The Victorian legal machinery realized a terrifying flaw in its design. The strict requirement for physical proof of sodomy made it nearly impossible to secure convictions against homosexual men who were discreet or who possessed the financial resources to hire competent defense attorneys. The government had been forced to watch Boulton and Park walk free, a stark reminder of the law's impotence. This institutional humiliation directly fueled a silent, aggressive hardening of legal and moral attitudes over the next 15 years. The authorities were determined to close the legal loopholes that had allowed the Strand Theatre defendants to escape the hard labor camps. The specter of Lord Arthur Clinton, a man of immense privilege who had brazenly flouted societal norms and seemingly evaded justice, either through death or exile, haunted the corridors of Westminster. Lawmakers recognized that they needed a weapon that did not rely on the impossible standard of anatomical evidence. This paranoia and legislative vindictiveness culminated in the passage of the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, specifically the infamous Labouchere Amendment. This piece of legislation criminalized any act of gross indecency between men, whether in public or private. It completely removed the requirement to prove sodomy. Merely writing an affectionate letter, sharing a bed, or expressing mutual desire was now sufficient to secure a conviction and a sentence of hard labor. The legal net was cast impossibly wide, designed explicitly to ensure that there would never be another humiliating acquittal like the one in 1870. It was this exact legislative weapon, forged in the fires of the Boulton and Park scandal, that would be utilized a decade later to completely destroy Oscar Wilde. Lord Arthur Clinton's tragic exposure laid the early groundwork for the most draconian anti-homosexual legislation in British history, transforming the legal landscape into a minefield for generations of men. Examining the emotional core of Lord Arthur's sudden removal from this landscape requires confronting the absolute brutality of Victorian aristocratic preservation. The Newcastle dynasty and the political elite did not act out of malice toward Arthur. They acted out of a cold, calculated necessity for self-preservation. When the letters were discovered in the Wakefield Street trunk, Arthur ceased to be a son, a brother, or a political ally. He immediately became an existential threat to the family's proximity to the throne and the Prime Minister's moral authority. The mechanisms deployed to neutralize this threat, regardless of whether they resulted in his actual death or his forced exile, were devastatingly cruel. If the official record holds true and Arthur died in a London room on June 18, 1870, the isolation of his final hours presents a portrait of profound human despair. A man who had endured the horrific violence of the Indian Mutiny, who had stood on the floor of the House of Commons, and who had loved fiercely and publicly, was suddenly reduced to a quarantined pariah. Abandoned by the political allies who had once sought his favor, shunned by the aristocratic society that had formerly embraced him, and separated from Bolton, he faced the absolute collapse of his existence alone. If he was handed a vial of poison by family operatives and instructed to do his duty to the Newcastle name, it was a cold extrajudicial execution sanctioned by societal consensus. He was forced to serve as his own executioner to spare the ruling class the embarrassment of a public trial. Conversely, if the public consensus was correct and he was smuggled out of the country to live as a remittance man in New York, his survival was purchased at the cost of his complete identity. The psychological torment of such an exile is difficult to overstate. He would have arrived in America stripped of his title, his military honors, and his history. A man raised at the absolute epicenter of the British Empire was suddenly a nameless ghost walking the crowded avenues of Manhattan. He was forbidden from ever contacting his former naval comrades, barred from acknowledging his own lineage, and forced to live in a state of permanent, paranoid vigilance. Every piece of news arriving from London, the political triumphs of his godfather Gladstone, the social ascensions of his siblings, the eventual coronation of the king he had once socialized with, would have served as a brutal reminder of the life he was forced to abandon. If Ernest Boulton's arrival in New York 4 years later was indeed a reunion, it was a reunion of two exiles who had survived the crushing machinery of the British state, but who could never reclaim the lives they had lost. Their defiance in London had been loud, proud, and uncompromising. Their existence in America, by necessity, had to be silent, hidden, and deeply cautious. The remittance man lived in a gilded cage of anonymity. The moment Arthur revealed his true identity, the financial lifeline from the Newcastle estate would be severed, and the British authorities would be alerted. His freedom was entirely conditional upon his absolute erasure from the historical record. Clinton's fate laid bare the ultimate Victorian paradox. An empire that easily absorbed his massive debts and wartime violence drew a lethal line at his private, consensual truth. The absolute necessity of Lord Arthur Clinton's disappearance becomes undeniable when one examines the precarious, rotting foundation of the Newcastle dynasty in 1870. The family presented a facade of impenetrable aristocratic strength to the British public, but internally the Clinton bloodline was teetering on the edge of total collapse. Arthur was not an isolated anomaly within a stable, highly disciplined noble house. He was the most visible casualty of a family that was systematically self-destructing under the weight of its own excess and its dangerous proximity to the throne. At the time of the Strand Theatre arrests, the family was headed by Arthur's older brother, Henry Pelham Clinton, the 6th Duke of Newcastle. The 6th Duke was not a steady hand at the wheel. He was a notorious gambler who possessed a stunning capacity for financial ruin. While Arthur had managed to accumulate an astronomical £70,000 in debt, the 6th Duke was busy squandering the core of the family fortune, eventually fleeing the country to evade his own creditors. The Clintons were completely financially compromised. Their political power, inherited from their father and maintained through their connection to Prime Minister Gladstone, was the only asset keeping the family out of the debtors' prisons. More volatile than their financial ruin was their intimate, highly volatile entanglement with the royal family. The Clintons were deeply embedded in the private vices of the Prince of Wales, the man destined to become King Edward VII. The prince was a notorious philanderer whose reckless behavior constantly threatened to destabilize the monarchy, much to the despair of Queen Victoria. Arthur's sister, Lady Susan Vane Tempest, was one of the prince's most prominent mistresses. This was not a passing, discreet affair. It was a deeply complicated relationship that was actively unfolding precisely as the Bolton and Park scandal detonated in the press. In late 1870, just months after Arthur's highly suspicious death, Lady Susan discovered she was pregnant with the Prince of Wales's illegitimate child. The British Crown was suddenly faced with a multi-front crisis emanating from a single radioactive family. On one side, the brother of the prince's pregnant mistress was the prime suspect in the century's most explosive homosexual conspiracy. On the other side, the mistress herself was carrying a royal bastard. The potential for a constitutional catastrophe was absolute. If Lord Arthur had taken the stand at Bow Street and faced cross-examination, the defense attorneys, desperate to save their own clients, would have aggressively leveraged Arthur's royal connections. The national press, already circling the Bolton and Park trial like bloodhounds, would have inevitably uncovered the link between the cross-dressing nobleman and the future king's mistress. The royal household and the highest echelons of the government could not allow a chain reaction that would drag the monarchy into a public trial centered on sodomy, cross-dressing, and bankruptcy. The machinery of state preservation activated with ruthless efficiency. The solution required surgical, permanent extraction. The pregnancy of Lady Susan was meticulously covered up. She was quietly spirited away to Ramsgate, where she delivered the child in absolute secrecy in 1871. The Crown heavily compensated those involved to ensure their silence. But Lady Susan's problem was biological and could be hidden. Lord Arthur's problem was legal, public, and moving rapidly through the courts. Arthur's sudden death from scarlet fever on June 18, 1870, must be viewed through this lens of sheer political desperation. It was the ultimate, necessary firewall. His removal immediately severed the toxic link between the underground homosexual subculture and the Prince of Wales. The moment the death certificate was signed, the threat of cross-examination vanished. The press lost their aristocratic target, and the trial of Bolton and Park was successfully contained as a scandal involving middle-class actors and civil servants, rather than a crisis exposing the moral decay of the ruling class. Following the announcement of his death, a secondary operation of historical erasure commenced. The Newcastle family administrators moved swiftly to quarantine his toxic legacy. His £70,000 debt was legally severed from the primary family estate, leaving his numerous creditors to absorb the catastrophic losses. The family archives at Clumber Park were aggressively purged. Letters, diaries, and personal effects detailing Arthur's life, his relationship with Ernest Bolton, and his financial dealings were systematically destroyed or locked away in restricted vaults. The Newcastle dynasty simply closed ranks and moved forward, deliberately amputating the memory of the third son to save the whole. Yet the attempt to erase Lord Arthur Clinton inadvertently catalyzed the exact subculture the establishment sought to destroy. The trial and the massive public interest it generated acted as a dark beacon. For decades, the homosexual underground in London had operated in terrifying isolation, consisting of fragmented networks of men who believed they were entirely alone in their desires. The relentless newspaper coverage of the Bolton and Park case, reprinting the intimate letters and describing the lavish theatrical lifestyle of the defendants, broadcast the existence of this community to every corner of the British Empire. Instead of being intimidated into submission, the underground learned and adapted. They saw the catastrophic mistake Lord Arthur had made in committing his love to paper using highly identifiable aristocratic stationery. They recognized the danger of living quite so loudly in the hotels of the Strand. The surviving members of the community did not disband, they evolved. The scandal directly accelerated the development of highly sophisticated, coded methods of communication. The use of Polari, a secret slang heavily utilized by the gay subculture to communicate safely in public, became deeply entrenched following the 1870s. Men learned to identify each other through subtle sartorial cues, specific eye contact, and guarded language that would mean nothing to a passing police officer, but everything to an initiate. Lord Arthur Clinton became a silent martyr to this hardened, evolving community. He was proof that their desires were not confined to the destitute or the criminal classes, but existed at the very pinnacle of societal power. The myth of his survival, the persistent belief that he had outsmarted the prime minister and the police to live out his days in New York, became a vital, empowering legend. In a world where the law demanded their execution or their lifelong imprisonment, the idea that one of their own had beaten the system provided a crucial psychological lifeline. The establishment had tried to bury him in a rushed, quiet grave, but the men who walked the midnight streets of the Haymarket and the Burlington Arcade ensured that his ghost continued to walk beside them. The spectacle of the Bolton and Park trial achieved something far more permanent than the exposure of a hidden subculture. It inadvertently birthed the modern media circus. Prior to 1870, the British press generally operated with a measure of deference toward the aristocracy, frequently suppressing scandalous details to protect the dignity of the ruling class. The Strand Theatre arrests completely shattered that unspoken agreement. Newspaper proprietors quickly recognized the staggering profitability of elite moral collapse combined with sexual transgression. The daylight transcripts of the trial, sold on street corners across the empire, proved that the public possessed an insatiable appetite for the destruction of their betters. Lord Arthur Clinton was the primary casualty of this new, aggressive era of journalism. His private, deeply affectionate letters to Ernest Bolton were the first of their kind to be mass-printed and consumed as daily entertainment by the working class. This widespread publication of his correspondence fundamentally damaged the myth of aristocratic moral superiority. For centuries, the British elite justified their absolute control over the nation's wealth and political power by claiming a higher moral and intellectual standing. When the working-class citizens of London read Arthur's letters over their breakfast tables, reading a member of Parliament refer to a male cross-dresser as his beloved wife, that justification disintegrated. The ruling class was exposed not merely as hypocritical, but as deeply intertwined with the very criminal underworld they paid the police to suppress. The government's panicked decision to erase Arthur, whether through forced suicide or orchestrated exile, was a desperate attempt to plug this catastrophic leak in their public authority. The absolute hypocrisy of this state-sponsored erasure becomes glaringly apparent when contrasting Arthur's fate with the survival of the man who shared his family's darkest secrets, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales. The prince was intimately entangled with the Clinton family through his ongoing, highly volatile affair with Arthur's sister, Lady Susan Vane Tempest. Both men engaged in behaviors that the strict Victorian moral code condemned. The prince frequently visited Parisian brothels, maintained a string of public mistresses, and was a compulsive gambler who repeatedly dragged the monarchy into the press. He was later forced to stand in a courtroom and testify in a highly damaging illegal gambling trial, the Tranby-Croft Baccarat scandal. Yet the Prince of Wales survived every single indiscretion. When Albert Edward ascended the throne as King Edward VII in 1901, he ushered in the Edwardian era, a decade celebrated for its immense wealth, relaxed morals, and aristocratic decadence. The state protected the king's transgressions with impenetrable walls of constitutional necessity and limitless capital. The monarchy simply absorbed his vices as the acceptable privileges of an heir. Lord Arthur Clinton, however, possessed the wrong kind of vice. The prince's rampant adultery reinforced traditional patriarchal dominance. Arthur's transgression actively subverted it. By living in a domestic partnership with another man and financially supporting a male partner who assumed a female identity, Arthur directly challenged the rigid gender binary required to maintain a militarized imperial nation. The British state could easily protect a corrupt future king, but it absolutely could not protect a nobleman who rejected the fundamental mechanics of Victorian masculinity. Arthur was a third son. He was entirely expendable. The legal machinery deployed against Arthur and his circle, also triggered a massive shift in how the state controlled sexuality. During the trial, the aggressive and completely discredited testimony of the police surgeon, Dr. James Paul, marked a critical turning point. Previously, the legal system had prosecuted homosexuality primarily as a severe moral sin and a violation of religious law. Dr. Paul's attempt to prove that Bolton and Park possessed physical deformities caused by their sexual practices signaled the beginning of the medicalization of homosexuality. The authorities stopped treating men who loved men merely as common criminals and began aggressively classifying them as biological anomalies and psychiatric defects. Arthur and Bolton effectively served as patient zeros in the emerging, highly destructive science of sexology. The thousands of letters seized from the Wakefield Street apartment did not disappear after the jury delivered their verdict of acquittal. The Metropolitan Police locked the correspondence away in deep archives. Decades later, early psychiatrists and criminal profilers combed through these confiscated documents. They dissected Arthur's unguarded, desperate words of affection to Bolton, analyzing them not as evidence of human love, but as clinical data points used to define a new category of mental illness. The very letters Arthur wrote to express his devotion were weaponized by the state to pathologize generations of men who came after him. Ernest Bolton's survival strategy in the aftermath of this institutional assault required a complete geographical and psychological severance from his past. He knew that the London stage would never fully accept him again. The police surveillance was absolute, and the threat of a secondary prosecution under new, harsher laws constantly loomed over him. Crossing the Atlantic in 1874 provided the necessary physical barrier, but the psychological distance was a far heavier burden to bear. Adopting the name Ernest Bine, he traveled the grueling, unpredictable circuits of the American theatrical frontier. He performed in New York and journeyed through the expanding cities of the American theatrical frontier. However, this exile was not permanent. He eventually returned to England, passing away at the National Hospital in London in September 1904, forever marked by the scandal that nearly destroyed him. The historical consequences of 1870 fundamentally altered civil liberties. While the British establishment failed to secure convictions under the old laws, the humiliation of the Strand Theatre arrests laid the early groundwork for a legislative backlash. The infamous Labouchere Amendment of 1885, which criminalized all forms of male intimacy, was born from this institutional paranoia. The absolute hypocrisy of this era becomes glaring when contrasting Arthur's fate with the survival of the Prince of Wales. The future king engaged in rampant adultery and illegal gambling, yet the state protected his transgressions with impenetrable walls of constitutional necessity. The prince's vices reinforced traditional power. Arthur's private truth actively subverted it. He was a third son, making him entirely expendable. The mystery surrounding his ultimate fate cements his status as a permanent historical enigma. Whether Lord Arthur Clinton succumbed to a perfectly timed dose of poison in a London bedroom or stood on the deck of a steamer watching his homeland fade away into a nameless exile, the tragedy remains the same. He was a decorated war hero, a prime minister's godson, and a living paradox who exposed the fragile hypocrisy of an empire. If a society must completely erase the truth of one man to maintain the illusion of its own perfection, who is the actual criminal?